As we enter year two of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, how united is the global community against Russia? Not as much as you might think. Yes, the West's core coalition remains remarkably solid, but you get a sense of the big picture when you look at this map that was published in the Washington Post differentiating those countries who have armed Ukraine or imposed sanctions on Russia and those that have not. And yes, on Thursday, the UN General Assembly approved a non-binding resolution that calls for Russia to end hostilities in Ukraine and demands the withdrawal of its forces. But while 141 countries voted in favor, 7 voted against, and 32 abstained. As the New York Times recently summarized, instead of cleaving in two, the world has fragmented. A vast middle sees Russia's invasion as primarily a European and American problem, rather than view it as an existential threat. These countries are largely focused on protecting their own interests amid the economic and geopolitical upheaval caused by the invasion. So against this backdrop, have the sanctions imposed by 33 countries been effective? In a piece in Fortune titled, "How the Russian Economy Self-Immolated in the Year Since Putin Invaded Ukraine," Jeffrey Sonnenfeld and Stephen Tian of Yale write, the 1,000-plus global companies who voluntarily chose to exit Russia in an unprecedented, historic mass exodus in the weeks after February 2022 have largely held true to their pledges and have either fully divested or in the process of fully separating from Russia with no plans of return. Quote, these voluntary business exits of companies with in-country revenues equivalent to 35% of Russia's GDP that employed 12% of the country's workforce were coupled with the imposition of enduring international government sanctions unparalleled in their scale and scope. So the picture presented is that it has really crippled the Russian economy. But in the same week, Gallup found this: sanctions fail to sour Russians' outlook on economy. The pollster summarizes more Russians see economic conditions improving than getting worse. Majorities across all regions are satisfied with their standard of living, and regions closest to the conflict have seen huge improvements in perceptions. How can that be? Joining me now to discuss is Mohammed Yunus. He's Gallup's editor-in-chief and editor of the Week in Charts. Thanks so much for being here. First of all, how can you get accurate polling data from Russia?
Well, we've been polling across Russia now for 15 years. It is not as hard as you think, but it's certainly not easy. And it's part of what we've been building since 2005 called the Gallup World Poll. And it's where we have now quantified the voice of 98% of the world's population. So we've been very hard at work throughout this conflict, trying to quantify people's voices both in the Ukraine, but also in Russia, in the United States, and in neighboring countries.
What accounts for the relatively rosy outlook on their economy that you found among the Russian people?
Well, and I don't want to overstate the rosiness of the outlook. Certainly, Russia and Russians have paid an enormous cost, both in loss of life and otherwise. But perceptions of people's own economic outlook aren't as negative as you would imagine, given the also likely very accurate and sound data that you started this segment with from economists. I think this is why giving people a voice in these situations is so critical, because it's easy for either side to really fall into the narrative of what their view is. From the Western view, as you mentioned, sanctions have been really a cornerstone of that policy. But if you look at some aspects of the Russian economy, say, for example, the value of the ruble, certainly people's own assessments, we don't see that pain, at least not yet, settling in on the popular level.
Mohammed, there's another matter of perception that I'm now having my eyes open to. I was under the belief that the world is united against Russia, that it's Russia and a couple of rogue states, you know, the usual suspects, Iran and North Korea. But the data that I pointed out at the outset in a great piece that was published in both the Washington Post and another in the New York Times opened my eyes to the fact that, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, it's just not the case.
You know, and the other thing that recently happened is the G20 failing to have a consistent communique around the situation in Russia. You're right, the world isn't united because the world is being impacted in different ways. You know, one of the things we do is track global hunger and also people's assessments of their own economic situations, not just in Russia, but across the global south. And we absolutely see the pain of inflation, of the conflict, in particular in countries that are really important grain importers from Russia and Ukraine, seeing the pain of this conflict. So from the perspective of the rest of the world, it looks at this conflict in a very different light than the U.S., which is really looking at it from the perspective of the global order. And the data we just came out of the field with, I know you're going to share, really drives home that point, at least here in the U.S.
We've spoken about the perception of Russians. We've talked about the global dynamics. Let's put up, thank you for giving to us the very latest in terms of American perspective and how folks here are looking at the war. What's the bottom line?
The bottom line is we continue to see an uptick in Americans viewing the conflict itself as an important or critical threat to the vital interests of the United States. It started out in the 40s, in the mid-40s, when actually the first round of this recent flare-up between Ukraine and Russia took place several years ago. But what's important to keep in mind, Michael, is both here in the U.S., in Russia, the resolve is really there for a prolonged conflict. In the Ukraine, it's highest of all. And we talked about that last time I was on the program. So from a public sentiment perspective, the critical populations to this conflict seem to be preparing for a much longer haul than many of us had hoped when the conflict started.